Thank you for joining us today for a conversation with Minnesota's Commissioner of Employment and Economic Development, Steve Grove. We're going to talk about navigating the economics of COVID-19 here in Minnesota. This is one in a series of virtual conversations that Tunheim, a communications consulting company, has hosted since COVID-19 altered the way we work and live. Making connections is an important part of our daily work, connecting people, ideas, organizations. So we appreciate the time and effort each of you is taking to stay connected, and in particular, appreciate your joining us virtually today. I'm Kathy Tunheim. I'm the CEO and principal of our company. We're an agency that works with clients to help them be better understood by the important stakeholders that they have. Our offerings include public relations, public affairs, digital services, and management consulting. Much of our work is done at the intersection of business and government, which brings us to why we're here today. I'm honored to welcome Commissioner Steve Grove for a conversation about how COVID-19 has altered Minnesota's business landscape in recent weeks and for the foreseeable future. Commissioner Grove was appointed to lead DEED at the beginning of Governor Walz's term, and he brings extraordinary business experience to the role. We in Minnesota are very, very lucky to have him. Many of the announcements that have been made to date about aid packages available for businesses and for workers are a direct result of the work led by Steve and his team at DEED. Before we begin, let me remind everyone, this is a live web conversation. We are at the mercy of Wi-Fi connections, so hope for the best and know that if there are any technical glitches, they will be brief. Our team will be on it. On the right side of your screens, my digital colleague, Nick, will be posting additional context and resources in the chat bar, so watch for those. We're also recording this conversation and it will be available later on Tunheim social channels. So let's get started. Welcome, Commissioner Grove. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks for having me. Excited to chat.
You know, I've been mentioning to people in conversation these last few days, when you start a conversation and say, how are you doing? It used to be a throwaway line, and now it feels like a sort of an important check-in. So let me start there. How are you doing?
You know, I'm doing pretty well. I would say that I'm actually grateful to have an opportunity to help right now. I think for so many of us at our Department of Employment and Economic Development, to have a way to help Minnesotans to be able to focus our energy, because we're human too, we have nervous energy just like everybody else, but be able to focus that on helping people is really a gift. So I'm doing pretty well. You know, I think all of us are working hard, people across government and business and elsewhere are trying to navigate this moment. And I will say that this is my first time in government service, so I'm learning as I go here, but it's just been really inspiring to be amongst public servants like those I work with at DEED who are just built for this kind of moment. You know, they're just ready.
For those who don't know, share just a minute about your history before you got to government service, because it's a pretty great one.
Yeah, well, I was in the private sector before. So I spent the last 12 years at Google, first at YouTube, building our first kind of news and political division there, and then at Google, ramping up our social media efforts, and then building a team called the News Lab that was focused on helping news organizations across the world survive a truly disruptive moment as the internet has changed the economics of news so starkly. So yeah, my background's in tech and in journalism. I'm originally from Minnesota, but moved away pretty soon after high school and just came back a couple of years ago after 20 years away. So glad to be back and here with my family and young twins, and glad to be working for the governor at a time when Minnesota needs government to really step in and help.
Well, as I said at the outset, we are very, very fortunate to have you. So thanks for your government service.
Thank you.
How would you summarize Minnesota's approach to helping businesses during COVID-19? What's the philosophy that you guys are bringing to the task?
Yeah, well, I think the first philosophy is protecting the health of Minnesotans. And so that's why the person you hear from second most in the state every single day is Jan Malcolm after Governor Walz. And so that is just a priority that the governor, I think, rightly takes in every decision. But so many of these decisions and so many of the things that we're doing are complex. And so the economics of this, economic impact of it are also on his mind all the time. And so, our philosophy there is, how do we minimize the destruction that this virus clearly has on our state's economy and start with those who are most affected? So really the philosophy is start with the most vulnerable people and help them first. So that's why the very first thing you saw us do was just open up unemployment insurance. This program that has been around since the mid 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt, launched it, and few people ever want to have to think about. We need to make it open for people to use. And so that was the governor's first executive order, which was just to reclassify what it meant to be separated from work to no fault of your own, which global pandemic is clearly a use case for that, but we need to make that clear. So we're starting with the most vulnerable, after unemployment insurance, and there's a lot more we can talk about there, but we then focused on small businesses, because I think, the smaller the business, the harder the challenge here. And so we know that almost half of Minnesotans work for a small business. So that's a huge cross section of our population. And so we started with small businesses too. And so we're trying to start with most vulnerable and move outward from there. And then the kind of the complex dance we find ourselves in state government is, how do you enable every possible lever you can at the state level while not overlapping what the federal government's offering? Because they have so many more resources. They can print money, they can go into debt. You don't want Minnesota taxpayers to be paying money to help businesses they could get from the feds anyway. So that's kind of the strategic exercise in some way, is how do you leverage that federal funding, bridge the gaps with some state funding, and just get the most possible ROI essentially that you can for businesses and workers in our state. And that's something we're navigating every day.
Yeah, that's great. So let's dig into a couple of those places, and let's start with the unemployment insurance. What steps is Indeed taken to make sure independent contractors and gig economy folks have some benefit as well?
Yeah, we hear this question a lot, and it's such an important one, especially as our gig economy has just exploded in the last 5 years, even really just in the last 2. What people, I'm sure, know is that unemployment insurance doesn't traditionally cover those workers unless they have signed up in a tax bracket that they themselves were paying into a trust fund for unemployment insurance. So bottom line is, this system wasn't built for the gig economy. And so how do you retool it for the gig economy is the big question. We as a state, nor can any state, do that on our own. The federal government has to act there, and they have. They have passed additional unemployment benefits in a disaster situation for gig economy workers and for those who are independent contractors, that will allow us as a state to pay out unemployment insurance-like payments to those who haven't been covered by that program in the past. It's taking longer than I would like, if I'm honest with you, because the federal government still has to give us guidance on what those payments should look like. And we don't have any wage history for those workers, which is how we essentially calculate what you deserve.
Right.
So, but we're building all the technical infrastructure to do that on our platform, so that as soon as the federal government gives states guidance, we'll be right in line to move on those payments. We hope it's a matter of days, could be weeks. We talk to the Department of Labor every day, but that's such a critical issue for Minnesota businesses and workers who aren't covered by the traditional program.
Yeah, it's such an important piece. In businesses like ours, we're working with freelancers and creative folks all the time. We have a fantastic population here in Minnesota, and it's heartbreaking to think of how scary it has to be. Yeah. So then let's talk about small businesses. How would you highlight what some of the resources that you're making available to small businesses? Let's go through that.
Yeah, so the first thing that we wanted to help small businesses take advantage of was the federal government programs offered through the SBA. And so there's some work we had to do immediately just to qualify Minnesota as a state that could draw those funds in, and we were one of the first to do it. So we opened up those funds quickly for Minnesota small businesses, and essentially the SBA is offering a disaster loan program that allows businesses to take out loans of up to $2 million at a very low interest rate, some of it forgivable over time, that will help them stay solvent at a difficult time. The program is a little slower just by the nature of being a federal government program than businesses might like. And so we additionally have adopted a few state government programs as well. One of them is a small business emergency loan program that has $30 million in it. We offer loans of between $2,500 up to $35,000 at 0% interest. So it's an even better interest rate than the federal government. They're 50% forgivable. And they allow small businesses to kind of bridge the gap essentially between now and when federal dollars can come. So that was an important move that we made. We also allowed cities and counties to open up their revolving loan funds that come from state dollars so that they can add an additional $28 million into the market. And then along with the legislature, we partnered on passing a small business loan guarantee program, because one of the things we're trying to do is how do you get private sector lenders more involved here, especially when loan applicants are not going to be super attractive to them given the state of the economy. How do you make that a little less risky? So we have a loan guarantee program out there. There's $10 million in it. That's not big money, but it's some money. And it guarantees up to 80% of a loan amount that an applicant would make. We've got about 40 banks signed up for it so far. So we're trying to leverage up to 25, maybe $30 million more worth of money from the private sector or private market too. So those are three of the big ones. I'd say, for any small business, start at the federal programs first, just because they take longer, they have bigger money and better terms, and we're going to ask you to do that anyway if you apply for a state loan, because we want to make sure people are going to the feds first, and then move on down to the state programs from there.
Great, really, really helpful. Thanks for that. I know, prior to COVID-19 entering our lives, you've been really focused on Minnesota's innovation and the startup economy here. Talk a little bit about what you are seeing. Are there hopes that we can maintain some of that momentum on the other side of this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's been such a big focus of ours in the first year of our time at Deed, and startups, similar to small businesses, face a lot of challenges in moments like this. So one of the things we've done is just work with the SBA to make sure that a lot of those levers that are available for small businesses apply to startups too. And there's some kind of annoying technical differences where that might not always apply. So we're trying to work through that with the SBA and connect startups to the SBA for more guidance there. We're also going to partner with Generator, which is a great startup accelerator in our state, to run a workshop, sort of a how-to workshop for startups and how to navigate this moment. I think it's going to be, I want to say it starts on April 6th, the 10th or something like that. So maybe we'll share more information in the links that Nick or others can circulate. But yeah, we want to do some outreach there too, to make sure that we can give a startup lens to this for founders.
Great. As you know, Minnesota has a proud tradition of business and civic leadership coming out of the private sector. And I know there are innovative companies that are coming up with things they think can help. Can you talk a little bit about what's the best way for private sector folks who think they have something to contribute? What's the best way for them to do that?
It's a great question. There are lots of ways. The simple answer to that is to email an email address that I'm going to give you right now, which is hsem.ppp@state.gov.us or state.mn.us. We'll circulate it so people don't have to write it down from my clumsy relaying of it. But the broader way is this: we have a state emergency operations center that is set up to try to engage as much of private sector help as we can get on a bunch of different vectors. And the governor has given us all in government different lines of effort he wants us to focus on. So getting more PPE available for hospitals, generating more ventilators, getting more testing capacity in the state. The group that I'm leading is economic security. How are we leveraging the private sector for economic security? So each of those efforts has essentially like a private sector counterpart. In our case, it's actually a private sector panel that's advising us on what we're missing, ways that private sector can partner with us. And so even just reaching out to Deed is helpful, because we're looking for ideas for partnership on economic security. If you got a discrete thing you can do, like all the firms that are now shifting to create face shields and other PPE for critical care workers, there are very distinct lines there. But if you've got brainstorms and ideas, reaching out to us at Deed is a great start. And it's government alone isn't going to get us through this. That's been clear from the very beginning. So we're grateful, never more grateful, to have such a civically minded business community in the state as we are now. Can
you share an example of maybe a surprising or interesting partnership that's happened yet?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch. I was just talking to the guys from Wyoming, or the gals, I should say, from Wyoming Machine the other day over in Wyoming. Yeah, they're incredible. Tracy Toppany, they make metal fabrication parts, and they've retooled their assembly lines to make ventilator parts for ventilators to be built. We've seen Frost River up in Duluth, the bag making company, shift to making face shields. Woodchuck USA has done that here in the metro as well. That's a company that makes journals and corporate gifts. Yeah. Right. And they're turning out face shields. So you're seeing a lot of that, and I know we'll see more.
Great. Another specific thing I wanted to make sure we talked about was Minnesota's shared work program. Could you talk a little bit about that and why that's an important tool for employers to keep in mind too?
Yeah, our goal, and I think it's everyone's goal, is to keep as many people connected to work as possible. The very bare minimum for health insurance reasons, but even beyond that, so that they're getting some degree of payment or wages at this time. And that's really hard when cost pressures are growing. And so shared work basically is a program that incentivizes an employer to not lay people off, to say, okay, if I need to cut my costs, rather than just lay off this section of the business, if I decrease the hours of everybody across a bunch of different units, say from 40 to 20 or whatever it might be, unemployment insurance can kick in and make up some of that gap, so that your worker who's working less hours now actually gets unemployment insurance benefits to make up some of the difference in their wage differentiation. usually you'd only give unemployment insurance benefits if the employee was let go, but shared work allows them to still do some work and get those benefits. So it's a popular program right now. We're taking in a record number of applications, and we're getting good feedback from our employers, and where we're getting that right and where we're not. It is a more complex thing to apply for just by the nature of how we do some of the calculations. But I'd encourage every employer who can to apply for it. We've got to keep as many Minnesotans connected to their jobs, because look, we're going to get through this. Like, this is going to be over at some point, and hopefully sooner rather than later. And when it is, the more people that are connected to a job, the better this will be. If you're out there and you have to then reapply, there's just these huge transition costs in HR and hiring and job search, and it's just tough. So, we know it's not possible for every business, and we know that these are really challenging times. But if you can do it, shared work is a great place to take a first step.
Certainly, in addition to all the things you said, you just think about the mental health and the anxiety of people to know that there is a chance to go back.
Yep, no question.
Right, but we can go back. I want to switch gears a little bit. We've seen great bipartisan support for the governor's actions to date, and as I've shared with you a couple of times, I hear nothing but just really positive and a great deal of appreciation for the way your whole team, led by the governor, have been conducting yourselves in all this. Some legislators have raised some questions or even concerns about decisions. Are there additional actions under consideration that are going to require legislative action? And if so, what kind of timelines are we talking about? And how can the rest of us be helpful as that process goes forward?
Yeah, it's important, right? I mean, any solution that the governor does with the legislature is going to be better and more accepted and stable by the people of this state than something he has to do by executive order. And he, right, as a former legislator himself, he believes that in his bones. So it is important. As you know, right now the legislature is not in session. Actually, just before I hopped on this call, I joined a meeting of the Senate work group on jobs in the economy of senators who are asking questions about how we're progressing, and I think that's an important step. What they're telling us is April 14th. Looks like roughly the date they may come back. I think they're still evaluating various things. So we are kicking up another series of proposals in collaboration with the legislature, because yes, the governor has executive order power right now, but that does not allow him to use general fund money. He can't appropriate money with that power. So there are limitations. It's not like the governor just becomes, king for the year with that emergency order. So we're very focused on it. I think one of the things that has reached our radar recently that we're going to be talking about a lot is that given this increase in unemployment insurance benefits by $600 a week, which is great, it'll help workers, survive this time. It actually may incentivize people to stay on unemployment longer than they otherwise might have, and it won't help critical care workers who have to stay at work desperately because we need them, but are often paid very low wages. Yeah. So how do you incentivize a critical care worker to not sort of give up and say, my gosh, like my neighbor's getting more money by going on unemployment, and I got to go out in the front lines in the epicenter of the battle, and I'm getting paid less. That's just not fair.
Right.
So that's a vexing challenge that we didn't create. Obviously, the federal government gave us a new benefit, and we're going to get that money from Minnesotans, but it does make me worried that critical care workers are going to really be squeezed, in the coming weeks. So we're looking at ways we can engage the legislature. Can we make up some of that gap through some general fund money? I don't know. We're going to navigate that, but we've got to help those in the front lines. They're the ones who deserve the help, need the help, and that's something I hope this coming next convening of the legislature that we can tackle.
Have a chance to do. We'll talk in a few more minutes about some of the other longer term things, but I can't help but say I've been doing some writing already about those of us not on the front lines. We have to be thinking about what's going to be different in the future. And one clearly is these people who have been described as essential workers. I mean, that changes the way you have to think about the value of that work.
Oh God.
In the future. It's going to be interesting to see, as you guys have got to stay focused on the balance in this short term, but I think there are some really long-term conversations that are going to be challenging for all of us too. So
no question.
Speaking of challenging, let's talk for a sec about the federal government. I think we all know, read it and we see it in the news, coordination with the federal government on COVID-19 got off to an just less than perfect start. But is the interaction getting better? Are there still big needs that are not being met from your vantage point as you think about economic security?
Well, it has been challenging to say the least. I think that I will just say this. I feel grateful to be in a state where our governor is open, honest, forward-leaning, examines data, isn't blustering and is just giving it to us straight and prioritizing the health of our citizens. I'll just maybe leave it at that.
Yeah.
It has gotten better a little bit, at least in our realm, in terms of our relationships with the Department of Labor, who's kind of our federal partner in all of this. And I have sympathy for them because they're navigating a lot as they roll these programs out, and there's some super complex decisions. But we're going to keep pushing them because these benefits that came out of the CARES Act are critical, and states are really limited in engaging on them until we get further guidance. And so, we appreciate that it takes some time to get that right, and we know that we need to be patient to some extent. But for some people, they just don't have. For many people, and I hear from them every day, they don't have time to be patient. They don't want to hear us say, "Be patient," where we're waiting guidance. They want to say, "Give me my money now so I can feed my kids and stay afloat and make rent." And so we're going to keep pushing very hard for that. And I'll say that, one of the things that's been beneficial for us is to be in some of these national conversations. We get on calls pretty regularly with the NGA, that's the National Governors Association, with NASWA, which is the National Association of Workforce Groups, just to hear what other states are doing and get ideas. I think you have this moment in our history where states are really having to exhibit leadership at times where it's lacking from the federal government. And so these kind of decisions are being made by governors, this kind of laboratory of democracy that's taking place around the country. It's critical that we're sharing information quickly, and where stuff's working, we accelerate and amplify it, and where stuff's not, we dump it and move on. And that's kind of the exercise that we're all going through.
I can't help but share. I was on a call earlier this morning. I'm on the board of Hennepin Health, and Jennifer DiCabellis, who's the new CEO there, was talking about all of the healthcare system leaders get together a couple times a week, and that same kind of sharing of information and figuring out how do we make sure we're taking care of Minnesotans. And it's not about whose balance sheet it ends up on. It's we've got to figure this out sort of real time. So I assume there's a parallel universe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's been good to see various sector groups, in the state kind of come together at this time to share thinking.
Yeah. How about counties and municipalities? You mentioned one instance already, that asking them to get into the loan business, and I had not caught up with that, so that was interesting. What else are we asking those other units of government to shoulder, and how is that going?
Yeah, I do think that revolving loan fund is a big one to free up some of that money. We do a call 3 times a week at 7 a.m. with chambers of commerce, across the state, and other business association and trade leaders, just to get feedback from them and hear what's working and what isn't. So a part of it is just information sharing. We're essentially standing up like a dozen new programs at once that all have very specific details around them that just need time to flesh out and explain. So, I mean, as Tunheim has well shown, good communication is critical here. And so we're doing our best to get that right. With states and cities, states and cities and counties, we don't think they need to shoulder the financial burden of this. That's for the state and the federal government to be able to do. But where we can help them take advantage of local funds, where we can coordinate some of the thinking across cities and counties in ways that help kind of share best practices, I think that's a good role for the state government to play.
That makes sense. So in Minnesota, we talk about stay-at-home men as opposed to shelter-in-place, which seems to be the term of art around the country. Was that a discussion that we wanted to do it a unique Minnesota way, or did that just happen because that's the way the governor talked about it?
No, it was a discussion. It was a communications discussion, really, and Kristen Beckman and the comms team gave this a lot of thought. The governor himself was a great communicator, gave it some thought. Shelter in place makes you feel like there's a tornado outside. It just has this kind of feel of like the sirens are rolling and all hell's breaking loose and you better go hide. And that's just not the kind of panic that we wanted to spark in our community. And I think Stay at Home says the same thing, but in a much more thoughtful way.
Yep.
And I think that's taken off. I think, the Minnesota model, because you bring it up, I think it has been to try to communicate calmly, thoughtfully, to be very planful. And for any time a decision is made, for us to think through the effects of that decision ahead of time and try to put some things in place that will mitigate those effects. And the governor himself will say, we're not going to get that perfect. These decisions are extremely imperfect and they're extremely difficult. But if there's things that we can put into place that kind of ameliorate some of the effects of them, then that's what we want to do as Minnesota. We've watched several other states just kind of, make tough decisions, no question, but just have to make them and let it all play out from there. And I think, we've had the benefit of not being in the state that say New York or Florida or California is with the number of cases that we are, which we're grateful for at this point, to be able to be a little more planful than maybe some of those states don't have the luxury of being, so that the Minnesotans can understand this. And I think you've seen that play out in positive ways. I mean, we've gotten good rankings on the stay from home sort of social distancing metrics that are done by various cell phone companies that track essentially movements of people and ensure that people are keeping their distance. I think, crime hasn't spiked like you might be concerned that it would. So, Minnesotans should take pride in our ability to come together and navigate these moments. And I think part of that is, to your point, the messaging and how we frame it up for people and how we want Minnesotans to think about this time.
Great. So talk a little bit about the process that you guys have to go through. My understanding is that almost 80% of jobs in the state of Minnesota are deemed essential. Is that right, first of all, that data point? And then just talk a little bit about that process of deciding how to decide who needs to stay home and who needs to go to work.
Yeah, every once in a while we step back and scratch our heads and go, my God, like, we're the department that's set up to grow the economy, and our key strategic goal right now is to figure out how to pause it. It's truly mind-boggling. So it was a very long discussion. I think, we want to look for any canonical source of data we can in a situation like that. So the Department of Homeland Security has this list of industries. It's called CISA, critical infrastructure industries, essentially, that we started with. But we didn't just want to take that and say, okay, we'll just use CISA and move on. We wanted to say, well, could we go further than that? Could we keep more businesses moving if we're thoughtful about the approach? And so we were able to kind of do what we call CISA Plus, if you will. We looked at CISA, which is this national database, and we added some that we felt like, given the unique nature of our economy, who works here, let's add some industries. And then to make it a little bit more clear, we use what's called NAICS codes, not to get too much into the weeds, but essentially it's occupation codes. So we got into job types, so that if you run a business and you're not sure which industry you're in, or you're on the fence of a few, you can go into the actual job code and see, like, do I qualify or not? But I'll say this, we started out with guidance, and we started out at like 78% of the jobs in the state that were critical. And we knew we'd have to be kind of open to what would then come in terms of requests for clarification. And we're now up to 82% are critical. And that just speaks to having had a process where we're going to engage the business community. We're going to learn from them. We're going to hear what's critical and what's not, and not be afraid to change our mind where we need to, because, it's impossible to get an order like that right on the first time. And I think the governor asked us to be open and have a process by which people could submit and engage further. And that's what we've done. And so I will say this, like, when we first talked about shutting down non-critical industries, just in my head, I thought, oh my gosh, that's like the entire economy. But when you get down to it, and it's really only 18% of the jobs in the state, I don't mean to sort of downplay how devastating of a thing it is. I know that it's devastating, but it's certainly not the kind of percentage that you might think when you begin that you'd end up at. And so
yeah, no, that's my reaction when I saw the statistic. I thought, okay, that does make it feel like we can get to the other side of this. Right. Get our way through that. You've talked about communications a couple of times, which I know we agree it's incredibly important in this situation. And the state seems to me to be working really hard to communicate with lots of different stakeholders. You've talked about some of the regular cadence that you're in with various folks around the state. Are there new collaborative measures that are being created between agencies at this time that didn't exist previously? Give us a little bit of insight into how this feels.
Yeah. It's evolved, I would say. We started out, I wouldn't say in our own silos, but certainly in our own chairs as, leaders of agencies, looking at, okay, what's the DEED approach going to be? What's MDH going to be? What's Commerce and others going to do? But we realized, and I think the governor realized sort of a week or two in, that in fact, probably the best way to attack this is, yes, agencies should do what they do best, but we also need some interagency groups that are going to focus on very discrete topics. And so, I think, these groups on critical care capacity, on ventilators, on testing amounts, on PPE, these kind of goal-focused groups get agencies aligned on a particular mission and a metric and a goal that everyone has to collaborate on, and that becomes kind of the galvanizing force. And you'll see even just later today more announcements from the governor on how he wants to navigate that for the state and how he wants to communicate that to the state. Because the idea here is stay at home was never about, all right, everyone just chill for 2 weeks and we'll be back. We'll be back after the break. It was very much, let's use this time, right? And so our efforts have only accelerated during this time to partner with the private sector and use this time to set goals. We want to be transparent about those goals with the public and let them know what we're trying to achieve to get Minnesota ready for what we know will be an increase in cases and for what we know will be further challenges economically. So that's been important. And then just in terms of communication, it is so much information to dispense to so many different audiences. And I think one of the things that we've learned from consultation with you, Kathy, and other experts in the field is just to think nimbly about this. And while you want to have clear, consistent messages across the board, you've also got to think about your audience. And so, we're looking into sort of ethnic media opportunities, greater Minnesota media opportunities, and also how do you give an audience enough of the idea such that they can take it and organically turn it into something else that matches their audience's needs. That's where social media, that's where the internet is so good at disseminating information. And so that's, I think, a big communications challenge for us right now is how do we liberate other Minnesotans to be the best messengers by taking what we're sharing and then, re-amplifying it to their audiences.
Right. Well, I know we're early in this process yet, I know, but I just have to say on behalf of lots of people, I think you guys have done a remarkable job of continuing to process that, to say, all right, what do we need to communicate today, and what are our options for how to do it, knowing that the next day the challenges are going to be different.
Yeah.
Solutions might be different too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Back to deed specific, and this is at the risk of sounding like I'm moving past the acute phase that we're in. I acknowledge we're still in this acute phase, but has this crisis highlighted any existing, I'll call them cracks in the state's workforce training programs or systems? Childcare comes to mind, that employees and their employers rely upon. I mean, what are some learnings that you're already starting to jot down to say, we got to come back to this? Yeah,
it's a important strategic issue and question. Yes, it has. I would say that in many ways I think it highlighted things we already knew were challenges, but it kind of gave us the permission to tackle them in a new way. And I guess one example would just be our virtual service delivery. We, as a workforce system, for example, in the state, are very focused on brick and mortar. We got 50 different, they used to be called workforce centers. We now call them career force centers across the state, where someone can walk in and apply for a job and get one-on-one counseling. And physical space in physical buildings do matter. But if you were building a workforce system from scratch today, I don't know if that's where you would start. You would probably start with the internet and with mobile distribution and virtual services and other ways for people to access content. And so we have had to, because of the stay-at-home order and health concerns, actually shut the doors of all those career force centers. So we're suddenly in a situation where we don't just get to tinker with a side project and how we're going to have a digital strategy. That's the strategy.
Right.
And so, whether it's, phone calls or video conferences, we're doing a lot of this kind of thing with the folks. We have a whole work group set up between both the leaders inside of the department, but also private sector leaders in this space to come up with new ways to deliver services. Because at the same time that we're having to close our physical doors, more people are unemployed in the state than have been unemployed for decades. And so the services are actually more important than they ever were before, at a time where we have to deliver them differently. So it's forcing us to innovate in ways that I think are ultimately going to be helpful for us. No one would ever wish a crisis like this upon ourselves, but there's going to be things that come out of this that are better than when we started, because this has forced us to think in new ways.
Yeah. I mean, it's the famous, never waste a good crisis kind of leadership messages. And you think about how to capture those learnings and when and how to share them. What's the right timing for that? Is there a push to rethink how to make some investments in Minnesota? And maybe this is part of what you guys are looking forward to in talking with the legislature. And what are some of those capabilities that we need to be willing to make investments in Minnesota that this crisis is really highlighting for us? For example, there's been a lot of discussion about e-learning and work from home in the past, right? All of a sudden, as you say, that it's not an idea now, it is the strategy to some extent.
Yeah.
But do we have the infrastructure in place to fully take advantage of what we're learning? Yeah,
I was going to say, broadband comes to mind right away. And that's been something that, the governor and our administration have championed from the beginning. I think we're at about 90% penetration at kind of the bare minimum speed you would want, but we need to do better than that. And every additional percentage is harder to get. And So one of the things that the school distance learning school project has shown us is that, broadband is essential. And for many people, even if they have access to it, they don't buy it because it's too expensive.
Yeah.
So, what do we do to increase broadband in the coming legislative session? Can we get some more money there to get more lines in the ground? I think that's a critical piece, and to improve speeds. And, we're thinking like, is there some kind of a subsidy program for families who can't afford it to get it now when it's more important than ever before? So I think staying connected is a big one. I think this critical care issue that I mentioned before is just really important. The governor says this time and again that these people that we always took for granted and you kind of just look past as you're at the grocery aisle or,
Right.
at a hospital or some other place, are suddenly, Superman and Wonder Woman. Like, they're the people that are keeping us going. And so how we think about the safety net for those people, I think, is critical. We've been, for some time, really advocating for paid family medical leave, for example.
Yeah.
It is embarrassing as a country that we are so behind the times in this global environment in terms of providing for the most vulnerable when they need that help. And by that, I mean, when a parent has a child, being able to leave their job to take care of that child and not have to take an economic hit at a moment when they actually have increased spending required to take care of that kid, or needing to step aside for health considerations or take care of a loved one because they're experiencing illness. Many states have done this. We have not. We're the kind of state that is prized being a great place for workers, and I think we need to continue to do that. And so paid family medical leave comes up as another obvious. I don't anticipate that's going to get done this session. So we're realistic about that, given where the Senate is on this issue. But I don't think there's ever been a time where paid family medical leave hasn't been more clearly in view as a critical policy lever for an economy, and especially for those workers who don't work for a company that pays them a good wage and adds this as a benefit because it's the right thing to do, but who are working hourly wage jobs at companies that don't have to offer that kind of incentive on their own. So I see those are some of the things that stick out.
Absolutely. Steve, talk a little bit about retraining of workers. This is a whole other area that your department touches. We have some of those tools and programs in place, but another thing you have to start to imagine as we come out of this is that there are going to be kinds of jobs that either don't exist anymore, or, to your point, have to be compensated differently. Do we have the infrastructure around training and retraining of people, as the economy on the other side of this is going to have some fundamentally different characteristics?
The short answer is no. And then the long answer is exactly what does no mean, right? And I don't know if any state would be able to say unequivocally yes.
You're ready, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even before this crisis, we've been involved in a research project on what you might call the future of work, which is to say we know jobs are changing in a rapid pace. Automation or artificial intelligence are changing the tasks that people do versus machines do. Are we ready as a state for the economy that we see coming 10 years down the line? And I think we know the answer is probably no, again, but then what does that mean in the more specific answer to the question? So I think one of the things we are going to need to continue to focus on is just what is technology and artificial intelligence automation mean for how we prepare our economy for the future? What do crises like this show us about the jobs and tasks that can be automated versus the jobs and tasks that can't? What do we learn from that? We can't waste the opportunity to learn from this crisis as it relates to those things. And then the question, to your point, Kathy, is then, so what does state government do about it? And do we have good mid-career training programs for someone to sort of shift a career halfway through if they kind of see on the horizon, like this job as a retail clerk is not going to be here for a while. How do I start now and avoid getting fired later to transition? And so, we mid-career training programs haven't had the best reputation, just generally speaking. Like the great models are out there, but they're fewer and further between. So I think it's just a huge opportunity for innovation for us in the state. And this crisis, I think, can help us do that, in the coming months and years.
And just to follow up on that, are there good examples around the country, around the world, about who takes on that responsibility? How much of that is government responsibility versus industry responsibility versus philanthropy, whatever?
Yeah. And that's something we always ask ourselves at DEED, because we can't do everything. And we know that the best kinds of training partnerships happen with business deeply involved. We got into this space in the training world for workforce over the past 30 years where the government took an increasingly large role here, just because companies felt less incentivized to do training because people change jobs every 7 years.
Yep.
Previous generations, people got a job, stay for 30. It made sense to invest in that worker. We still think it makes sense to invest in the worker, but we understand employers thinking, well, gosh, I'm not going to put an expensive training program in place if my guy's going to leave in a couple of years. So government's played more of an increasing role, but it's been a little bit to the detriment of the worker because government's never going to train you as well as a business could. And that's just a fact. So I think the big thing here is partnership. Like, how do we make sure that businesses are involved in all the training programs that government does, such that there's a job at the end of that training pipeline and that we're doing the right stuff versus just kind of training you and then sending you off into the market to find a job when, good luck, right? We don't want to do that. No one wants to do that. So I think it's a good time to rethink some of those models. And we've been doing that already, but this will accelerate it, I think.
Yeah, I hope that those in the audience listening to us, if you're in the private sector, I hope we all are taking the opportunity to reflect on what role we need to play in that, both in terms of specifying what the work is. I know in the past that was one of the things I found really interesting, that there's this intention to rely on government without taking the responsibility to make sure the government understands what it is we need.
Exactly.
On the private sector side. So I'll look forward to working in whatever ways we can on that together. You used the phrase a few minutes ago, laboratory for democracy, and I know that's something that you've talked about before. So in that spirit, so share that philosophy with us a little bit, share a little bit about the experience you're having, and I want to make sure the listeners have an opportunity to feel as confident as I do about your leadership and the governor's leadership, because it's an incredibly thoughtful process and orientation that you bring to this. So just share a little bit about your thinking.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, particularly given where things are at the federal level, I think states have had to lean in heavily. And to the sense that's a gift, it's that, we get to try stuff and share it and learn across states and across governments and adapt and improve programs by sharing and trying things. And I think one of the things that governments don't do well is try and fail, because they're so nervous to try stuff that then fails and then blows up in the public and all the spotlight's on you. And suddenly, you should never tried that. And that's something for me, coming from a company like Google, where trying and failing is something you got rewarded for. In government, you get punished for it.
Right.
So part of it,
such an important thing. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. And so part of the trick is, how do you create a safe space where you can try some things and fail and then try them again. And maybe there's certain things you're not going to try to fail at because you can't have your unemployment insurance system crash or other things fall through the cracks, but there's certainly a lot you can try. And so how do you create that safe space inside of government is a big question. We're in the process, we've only accelerated it, by the way, since this crisis began, of creating an innovation lab inside of DEED that brings in some private sector experts, those who've done this kind of work in governments before, to create that kind of a space for our employees, to give them a chance to bring new ideas and again, try stuff and see if it works. And then there's just this broader point of, how do we share ideas across states? I'll give you an example of this. In the past few weeks, we've been figuring out, what do we do for small businesses? And we talked about some of those programs a moment ago. I get a report from a researcher on my team every day of the new stuff states are trying. And as I look at those reports, one of the things was, okay, so in Massachusetts, they started a small business loan program that had, I think $10 million in it, but they let the cap be $75,000. And as soon as they launched it, it was depleted in 3 days.
Right.
And so, suddenly you're like, okay, well, we're going to learn from that test, and we're going to lower our cap to 35K, and we're going to put 30 million in it. That's just the kind of stuff that, every state's trying to figure this out, but you got to learn from other attempts in other states and other cities and counties, and try to just move quick and try new things.
I think I'm really energized to hear you talk about it. I know we have extraordinary public employees across the state of Minnesota.
We do.
Lots of great experience, lots of great energy, and needing to be given the opportunity to be innovative and creative. And as you say, not be penalized for it.
Yeah.
It's great. Steve, what have I not asked you about that you want to make sure a bunch of folks in the business community need to hear? Anything that we haven't covered? I really appreciate the sharing of the information. I know, as I said at the outset, there's been on the right side of the screen lots of additional information that came from your team that we've been posting, and we'll continue to do that as we push this out.
Yeah.
Anything we missed that?
I would say no. This has been a very, very thorough set of questions and a great opportunity for us. So thank you for the chance to engage your audience with this conversation. I think the the business community listens to you, listens to Tunheim. And so we're grateful for the chance to connect with them here. I think, we've covered a lot of bases. I would say that, our big ask is just to ask every business leader to try to continue to exercise leadership in your own communities, to keep people calm, to listen to them, to know how painful and hard this is. And I guess the message I would want government to share in that context is just, we know we're not getting all this right. Like, we know that there's so many decisions that have been made that aren't perfect. What the governor tells us is, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Make thoughtful decisions, move forward. He's making a lot of tough decisions with imperfect information. We all are. But if we just stay calm, look at the data, share information, be planful, work together, as a community, I think we'll go a long ways. And I'll just say again, as someone who kind of came back to the state after having been gone for 20 years and just kind of getting introduced to this business community myself for the past couple of years, I've never been more grateful to be in a state where business and government have the kind of relationship that we do here. And frankly, just where we have a business community that has such a civically minded perspective. We are so lucky in this state. That's not hyperbole. It's just true. And we're grateful for it. So to all the business leaders watching, thank you, thank you, thank you. Please keep reaching out to us. Please keep doing stuff on your own. We're seeing so much great organic activity. It's going to take that kind of collective energy to get us through this, and we will get through it. That's what people need to remember. And it will be painful and hard, but there's going to be another side of this, and we're going to make sure it's even better than where we were before. And that's going to take all of us working together. So thanks, Kathy.
Well, let me add my thanks to you, Steve, for joining us today. I want to thank the Tunheim team who made this possible. We're hosting another mini commercial here. We're also hosting complimentary office hours by appointment. If there are organizations out there who need some advice and some counsel, there's a link on the chat bar. Go ahead and sign up and get some free time with one of our senior folks to give you some advice. As I said earlier, there will be a recording of this discussion later today on Tunheim's LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram channel, so look for that. If you have the opportunity to share it with those who weren't able to join us, that would be great. And you can follow us there for notification of other potential future webinars. Thanks very much for joining us. Thanks again, Steve. Stay home, everybody. Stay safe. Be well.
Thanks, Kathy. Bye.
Thanks, Steve.